Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's nice to see everybody back in person. Welcome to HPA's 2022 Annual Conference and Expo covering New York. I'm Eric Linzer, President and CEO of the New York Health Plan Association, and we're really excited to have you all with us today. Now, before we get started, we've got a great program set up for you, and while she couldn't be with us today in person, Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins was kind enough to provide us with some pre-recorded remarks to help us open the day and welcome you all back in person. So with that, I'm going to ask us to turn on the video. If you'll take a couple of minutes and watch along with me. We're excited for the day and we're looking forward to her comments.
Hello all. I'm so glad that you're able to once again be gathered in person for this year's conference. I'm honored to join you virtually and have the opportunity to speak to New York's health plan community. I'm so deeply thankful to all of our partners in the healthcare industry who continue to show up every day to confront the challenges we face. This past year, I've shared several times that the pandemic was a chance to look at our inequities, where we're falling short, and to emerge forward on a better path. We cannot move backwards in our healthcare system. Our job as legislative leaders will be to ensure we are doing our part to make healthcare more accessible and improve transparency. The Senate majority understands the labor shortage crisis surrounding healthcare and home care workers. The exorbitant cost of caregiving was only exacerbated during the pandemic for New York families. In this year's budget, we secured historic funding to provide relief for our healthcare workforce and ensure New Yorkers are receiving the highest quality of care. We fought for and secured an historic $1 billion investment in home care worker wages, $136 million for the healthcare and mental hygiene worker bonus, $1.15 billion for distressed hospitals, a total of $19.9 million in legislative grants for public health. Our priority has remained to make healthcare more accessible and affordable, which is why we extended our Medicaid postpartum coverage to 1 year after the end of pregnancy for all, including undocumented individuals, and also providing Medicaid coverage now to undocumented people 65 and older, and expanding eligibility for the Medicare Savings Plan. Rising prescription drug prices has been devastating to New Yorkers who depend on prescription drugs to keep them healthy. That's why the Senate passed a bill that requires prescription drug manufacturers to notify the state of certain drug price increases. Starting with this bill and other actions, the Senate majority is committed to finding ways to curb the increasing cost of prescription drugs. We are holding pharmaceutical companies accountable and working with them to offer more affordable medications. The Senate majority is also committed to greater transparency in the healthcare industry. That's why we passed the HEAL Act, prohibiting contract clauses that restrict price transparency disclosure between health plans and providers. Finally, as a conference, we are constantly refining our vision of what healthcare in New York could be and the best ways to provide coverage for all New Yorkers. The Majority Conference is engaging with a wide array of stakeholders, including the health plans, to get feedback on the current state of New York's healthcare system, to identify ways to increase quality and access, and to develop options to decrease the number of uninsured. Issues such as benefit coverage and financing are being studied in order to ensure that any possible system changes does not lose the quality of care, including timeliness of appointments and services. The health plan industry has experienced many of the same challenges faced by those on the clinical front lines of this pandemic, but has faced unique issues of their own. Work hours and environments have also changed. There were, and still are, shortages of professional staff in your industry. Stress piled up and mental health status declined. But this area of the healthcare sector has faced some of the most broad and long-standing mandates from the state. Your flexibility has ensured that many New Yorkers have not had to take on large bills for COVID-related vaccination, testing, or care. That has saved lives. We know that we'll have upcoming challenges in our next legislative session, but our state's residents expect leadership and action from their government, and we will continue to work with Governor Hochul to confront this crisis and help struggling New Yorkers. Healthcare is essential to our communities. I look forward to continuing our work together. Thank you.
Well, once again, we appreciate the Senate Majority Leader being so generous with her time, and as an association and as an industry, we certainly look forward to working with her and her colleagues in the Senate in the upcoming session on ways to make healthcare better, simpler, more affordable, and more equitable for all New Yorkers across the state. Now with that, so as I said, it's been a long time since we've been together. It's been nearly 1,100 days since we closed out HPA's 2019 annual conference right here in this room, and a lot's changed since that time, both for our state, for our economy, and also for the healthcare system. When we concluded our conference in 2019, the first coronavirus case hadn't even been detected in the state yet. Virtual meetings were a novelty, and many of us were working 5 days a week in the office. Since then, masks and vaccines have become important tools in stopping and spreading the risk of COVID. Technology has become even more important, both in the delivery as well as the administration of healthcare. And our plans have continued to make significant investments to tackle the underlying social, economic, and environmental factors to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in care and ensure an equitable system for all. Now, today's session is going to provide a lot of important insights on the most important issues facing our healthcare system, our state, and our economy in New York. And we're pleased to have a number of terrific local and national speakers, policy experts, and folks who are going to give you a lot of important perspective on really what last week's election meant, where the healthcare system is going, and most importantly, how do we address some of the inequities in healthcare. So we hope that you find today's program both informative and provocative. And before we get started, I wanted to thank all of our sponsors who help make today possible, especially our diamond level sponsors, DentaQuest, Liberty Dental, GoodRoot, and Moving Analytics. Our platinum level sponsors, Capital RX, Mom's Meals, and Sandata. And our gold level sponsors, HPA Exchange and Nokomis. Now, without them and all of our sponsors, today's conference wouldn't be possible. And I want to thank them as well as our exhibitors for being here and encourage you during the breaks to make sure you take some time to check out our exhibitors because there's some really interesting and cool stuff going on out there. Additionally, I'd like to thank the HPA team. Kathleen, Ashley, Leslie, Kathleen, Arlene, Ashley, Leslie, and Kathy for your hard work on today's conference, but also your hard work every day on behalf of the industry. I know it goes noticed by our members every day, and I just want to once again thank you and let you know how much we appreciate your hard work. Now it's my pleasure to introduce HPA's board chair, Michael McGuire, the CEO of United Healthcare of New York. So as many of you may know, after 34 years of service at United and the health insurance community, Michael will be retiring. We've been fortunate to have him as our board chair for the last 3 years. He's been a strong voice on behalf of our industry, and Michael, as one of your last official responsibilities as chair, is to help us kick off today's conference. On a personal note, as I said both last night, and I'll repeat it again, Michael, I want to share with you how much I've appreciated your willingness to offer your insight, your mentorship, and your friendship the last 3 years, and you're going to be greatly missed. So folks, please join me in giving a rousing response and welcome to Michael to help us kick off today's conference.
Good morning. Thank you, Eric. And yes, it's true, after 35 years, it's time to start the next chapter. But we've got to continue with today. We've got a job to do today. So welcome to HPA's annual conference. It's one of the many forums that HPA holds throughout the year in an effort to generate discussion among all of the healthcare industry and all the participants in that industry to promote affordability, safety, and coordinated care for all the residents of New York. Thank you for joining us today. I think we have a very good agenda, some really great speakers, and some really good topics. It's great to see everybody, as Eric had said, after 3 years to be back in person. It's really important when you think about it, that interaction of what more can get done. And you can see that just by the camaraderie in the room and the discussions going on and the discussions that will go on throughout the day. We've done great work at HPA and in the industry. We should be proud of that. The last 3 years have been, like nothing we've ever seen before, but we continue to stay focused on the residents of New York, working with our providers and the healthcare systems, with patients and with employers, helping them provide benefits for their employees. So we remain focused. Obviously, it's very, very important, and great work continues to get done. Today's is a great opportunity. We'll talk about the election 8 days ago, what's gone on, and how that affects both the country and then locally in New York. We'll talk about affordability facing our residents and the employees of the state, and those factors that drive healthcare costs. What are those factors? What have they been? And what do we see what they look like going forward? And what can we do about that together? And then before lunch, we've got a really good panel that will look at advancing equity and inclusion across the healthcare system, and putting more people and getting more diverse members in the pipeline as we look to the future for our future leaders in the healthcare industry. So with that, I'm looking forward to today's conversations. Thank you all for attending. It's great to see some familiar faces, and I really think you're going to enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Before I turn the dais over to Michael and our first panel, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, the HPA staff will be available throughout the conference, so if you have anything, please certainly grab one of them. We've gone almost paperless this year, with the exception of a few pieces of paper. We've tried to become more environmentally friendly. The QR code on the back of your name badge will take you to our microsite. We figured you're all going to be on your phones anyway today, so this is a good opportunity for you to be able to scroll through the agenda, bios, information on our exhibitor sponsors, as well as the evaluation form. The QR code is also available on your table along with the Wi-Fi information. Now, we've taken a number of precautions to ensure the health and safety of all of you, and have made masks available throughout the conference in case anybody needs one or feels that it's important, or in the event that you are not feeling 100%. While we hope you stay for the entire program, if you do need to leave prior to the conference's conclusion, we just ask that you return your badge to the registration desk downstairs. Finally, we've provided cards on the table for folks who may want to ask questions during the course of the discussions. Our new intern, Danielle, will be picking these up. There's Danielle, welcome. This is her first official day with HPA. She'll be available to collect your questions. Just write your question, put it up. We'll collect them and we'll provide them to the panelists. So now it's my pleasure to once again turn the dais over to Michael to introduce our first panel. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so we are going to kick the morning off with our first panel, and our discussion will be around understanding the midterm elections and what decisions 2022 means for the healthcare industry. So with that, I'd like to call the panelists to the stage. I'm going to start with Dr. Don Levy. He's the director of the Siena College Research Institute. He's been with Siena College since 2007, has been instrumental in focusing Siena's polling not only statewide, local, and national politics, but also topics like the economy, social and cultural issues that are all important to New Yorkers. Under his leadership, Siena's Institute for Social and Community Research has had a unique focus on issues related to health policy in New York State, including research for many organizations, associations, and state and local health departments. And Siena has consistently been graded as one of America's leading academic polling institutes by Nate Silver and 538.com. Don, come on up. Also, with us today is Amelia Adams. Since 2018, Amelia has been the president of Adams Advisors, which specializes in political campaigns, government affairs, and community engagement. Previously, she served as director of New York Communities for Change, and later became senior advisor and the director of community engagement for New York City's first Latina Council speaker, Melissa Mark Vivero. I practiced that before I knew I was going to get it wrong. Sorry, I apologize. Amelia has also served as political director for Mayor Bill de Blasio's re-election campaign, and is a founding member and current treasurer of 20 in 21. Amelia, please join us. Next, I'd like to introduce Liz Benjamin, Managing Director of Marathon Strategies. Liz is a former reporter for more than 2 decades with 2 decades of experience covering New York State and New York City government and politics. She began her career at the Albany Times-Union, where she spent 10 years moving from covering local government and Albany City Hall to the state capitol. She has spent 4 years at the Daily News as a political blogger and columnist, and then for 8 years was the host of Capital Tonight and the editor of the show's companion blog, State of Politics. Welcome, Liz. Finally, with us today is Bill Hammond, Senior Fellow for Health Policy with the Empire Center for Health Policy. Bill generates data, analysis, and commentary illuminating how decisions made in Albany and in Washington affect New York patients, providers, taxpayers, as well as the state's broader economy. Before joining the Empire Center in 2016, Bill spent almost 3 decades in newspaper journalism, most recently as a columnist and editorial board member of the New York Daily News from 2005 to 2015, and also wrote for the New York Sun, the Daily Gazette of Schenectady, and the Post-Star of Glen Falls. Welcome, Bill. So we'd like to start with, I'm going to turn it over to Don. He's going to give us a little bit of a presentation on the elections, and then we'll go to the panel for some questions. Remember, there are cards on your table, so please, if you've got a question, you want to hand it up. We'll hand it up to the intern, and then we'll get those to the panelists. So with that, here we go.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's great to be with you. It's certainly great to be here in person. You know, I felt like my office is in the basement of Heinz Hall, for any of you who are Siena people. And it's quasi-subterranean, so to get out in the world is really a wonderful thing. Siena College Research Institute is a full-service polling institute. As many of you know, we conduct not only political polling, but we do a great deal of economic, social, cultural, and we work with many clients, many of you within the healthcare industry. This is just a quick look at some of the folks that we work with on a regular basis. And we're very proud that over the years, our work has been singled out with a very high rating from 538.com. They're one of the polling aggregators. We are a phone shop. For those of you who are polling aficionados, we continue to conduct our interviews via phone, overwhelmingly via cell phone. But if during Q&A we want to talk about some of the differences in the polling industry, I'm certainly happy to do that. I will mention and get this out on the table before we go much further. Some people say that polling is not as accurate, perhaps, as the marketplace would like us to be. Certainly, we had a fantastic year this year. We had minimal error across our last 23 polls. In response to what had been a problem in 2020, that being non-response bias, some people argued that that was a non-response bias of Republicans in terms of Republicans being less inclined to take polls from pollsters like myself. We found that to be the case, but we found it a little bit differently. We found that the folks who were least inclined to respond to us in polls were those who were the most ardently in support of former President Trump. So we made some adjustments in our quotas this time. We made some adjustments in our weighting schema, which resulted in us ending up with a series of very accurate polls. We have been working with the New York Times since 2012. We have an enduring partnership with the Times. This year, we polled in partnership with the Times the states of Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, as well as congressional districts in Kansas, New Mexico, and Nevada. We also, this election season, partnered with Spectrum News, Liz's old haunts. And with Spectrum News, we polled the states of Ohio, Wisconsin, Florida, Texas, and congressional races here in New York. In this election cycle, we conducted 16,757 interviews using live operators with people across the United States. To give you an indication of some of the challenges that we face as pollsters, in order to do those 16,757 interviews, we used our call center here at Siena College. We also had auxiliary call centers in Texas, Virginia, and Florida, and we made 2.1 million phone calls in order to conduct those 16,000 interviews. Let's take a look a little bit at the conditions of the country, the mood of the electorate as we entered this election cycle. The mood was particularly dour this year. What you're looking at there is the question that we ask at the beginning of virtually every poll. Do you think that the United States is on the right track, or is it moving in the wrong direction? It's the first question that respondents experience when we call them up. And you can see there that the national number was only 24%, 1 out of every 4 Americans felt as though the country overall was moving on the right track, whereas nearly 2/3, this is from a national poll, indicated that they thought the country was moving in the wrong direction. Beneath there you see when we asked that question in several states, but we asked it about that state. So for example, in the state of Texas, a plurality of Texans felt as though Texas was moving in the right direction. But when we asked those same Texans, what do you think about the country? They responded negatively, as respondents did in virtually every single state in the country. That dynamic, before we start talking about any of the other issues that were important to voters, set up a situation that predicted a change in leadership on the part of voters. When voters are nearly 3-to-1 saying they think the country's moving in the wrong direction, that points to a change in their voting pattern, and in this case, it would have pointed towards a potential red wave. What issues were important to voters? We continue to ask this in virtually every survey that we did in September, early October. What's the most important issue to you when you're going to make your voting decision this year? What's your second most important issue? Overwhelmingly, voters told us that what was important to them was the economy, was inflation, was cost of living. The second tier of issue changed between whether people were in what state they lived in, what party they subscribed to. But again and again and again, we saw issues like crime, abortion, and threats to democracy showing up as important to voters. The other issues that you see below that line were noted by respondents, but they tended to be cited far less frequently. In fact, when we looked at the election as it played out, certainly the issue of crime ended up being extremely important here in the state of New York. The issue of abortion ended up being extremely important, especially in states where they had an initiative that was specific to that issue. In fact, when we polled respondents nationally, again and again, we saw that about 62% of all Americans opposed the Dobbs decision, and a similar percentage felt as though abortion should be always, or at least sometimes, legal. So the national perception of that issue was not in keeping with the Dobbs decision. In terms of threats to democracy, that was a far more important issue, by and large, to Democrats than it was to Republicans when we were giving them this open-ended question and allowing them to voice it. Now, you'll notice that healthcare did not make the top of the list. Certainly, I would argue that healthcare in many Americans' mind is an economic issue, and I think that the manner in which I didn't have a full chance to look at those T-shirts, but I think that the T-shirts that everybody has at their table points to that. So when Americans are telling us that the cost of living, that inflation, that the economy is a concern to them, one of the components of that is how much does it cost me to insure my family? How much does it cost me to get the prescription drugs that I require? Taking a look at the issue of democracy for a moment, we asked the question, we said, which comes closer to your view? American democracy is currently under threat, or American democracy is not currently under threat? This was an extremely surprising question when we asked this. We found, disturbingly, that over 70% of Americans told us that they feel as though the American democracy is under threat. What was surprising was this was one of the issues that we found agreement across the political spectrum. Both Republicans, self-identified Republicans, and self-identified Democrats, as well as independents, at the rate of 70% or greater, feel as though democracy is under threat. However, they saw the threat differently. In fact, when we said, we're going to read you a series of people and entities, to what degree do you think these people or entities are a threat to democracy? Amongst Republicans, 90% of Republicans told us that they thought that Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. 90% of Republicans. Similarly, 96% of Democrats told us they thought that Donald Trump is a major threat to democracy. Other threats that rose to the top, the mainstream media was cited by 84% of Americans as a threat to democracy, and the Supreme Court was cited by 60% of Americans. As we drew closer to the election, all of us who were interested in it started to wonder, okay, we've got a potential red wave, the country's in a sour mood, the economy is struggling and it's the top issue. What effect did the leaders of both parties have? We came into an election with the President of the United States, Joe Biden, with a negative approval rating. He was underwater by nearly 20 points. This was slightly more dramatic in some states than others. In a couple of cases, New York being one of them, Joe Biden was seen positively. But we came into an election with the President of the United States being seen negatively across the United States. It didn't seem likely that Joe Biden was positioned to pull candidates from his party across the finish line. What about the leader of the Republican Party? Some could argue that maybe Donald Trump is not the leader of the Republican Party. But looking at the Trump effect, we saw that his national favorability was 10 points underwater, slightly better than Joe Biden's. However, when it came to issues of his effect on the American democracy, we saw 54% feeling though he went too far after January 6th, and that threatened the democracy. And a majority felt as though he actually had committed serious federal crimes. So we entered an election where the national mood was negative, voters had tremendous concerns, both leaders of both parties were seen negatively. So what do we expect to happen? Here's 4 different scenarios that were being discussed as we approached the election. The one that garnered a popular narrative was there was going to be a red wave, that the Republicans were going to sweep across the country. They were going to win a number of the hotly contested United States Senate races. They were going to pick up as many as 60 seats in Congress. And voters were going to express their dissatisfaction with the economy, their dissatisfaction with President Biden, and they were going to throw the bums out. Another scenario was that the Republicans were going to win by a little bit, that they were going to gain control of the House, they were going to gain control of the Senate, but not by very much. 2 others that really didn't get a lot of broadcast were that the Democrats were going to do well, that the Democrats were going to hold. They were going to hold the Senate and perhaps hang on in the House and push that to an almost break even. And the 4th one that only a couple of prognosticators thought was possible was there was going to be a blue surprise. And the Democrats were actually going to pick up seats in the House and push their Senate majority to as many as 54 seats. So what happened? We took a look at, these are some of the states that we polled. I'm going to talk a little bit about several states, but I'd like to talk about a few of the dynamics that we saw in the race. Here's some of the folks who won as governors in many of the states that we polled. And here's some of the candidates that we saw prevail in the United States Senate. And you'll see on that one, the right-hand side of the screen, that we still have one Senate race yet to be determined. As I indicated, our polling was highly predictive. In fact, each of those faces that I just displayed to you were races that we called, and for the most part, called extremely accurately. What dynamics did we see? One of the things that was really different this year was the degree of ticket splitting that voters expressed. Voters, we have seen in poll after poll after poll, certainly in the 2020 election, the 2018 election, are highly partisan. we saw rates of 95, 97% of Democrats saying they're voting for all the Democratic candidates, similar rates of Republicans saying they're voting for all the Republican candidates, and then you'd see the election fought out amongst the independents. In this election, we saw dramatic ticket splitting in many states. So for example, in the great state of Ohio, where Mike DeWine was running for re-election, he ended up winning by 25 points. Our polling had him winning by 24 points. And in the hotly contested Senate race in Ohio, J.D. Vance ended up winning by 6 points. Doing the math quickly at your table, you'll realize that 9%, nearly 1 out of 10 Ohio voters split their ticket. Nearly 1 out of 10 Ohio voters ended up voting for Mike DeWine for governor, but they voted for Tim Ryan for Senate. We saw a similar dynamic in the state of Pennsylvania. There we saw about a 10-point difference between voters who voted for Josh Shapiro for governor and those that voted for John Fetterman. So there were voters who voted for Shapiro and Oz. So what did that tell us about the electorate? Certainly Mitch McConnell's comments during the build-up to the election that candidates matter seemed to come to roost in some of this ticket splitting. We saw it in Georgia as well, where Brian Kemp ended up winning by about 7 points, but Raphael Warnock is ahead by a single point. Similar dynamic in Arizona, similar dynamic in the great state of Nevada. So where did we end up? I didn't have a chance to change the House numbers. They changed a little bit overnight, but the story remains the same. The United States Senate currently remained in control of the Democrats, and it appears as though our Senator Chuck Schumer, who was reelected, will once again be the Senate Majority Leader and have either a 50-50 Senate to work with or a 51-49 if indeed Raphael Warnock wins the runoff. The House has now turned to Republican control. It's yet to be determined whether Kevin McCarthy will hold on and become the Speaker of the House. He's got some internal challenges to face, but it looks as though we're going to end up at approximately 221 to 214. Is that a red wave? Of those 4 scenarios, is this the small Republican win, or is this the Democratic hold? It feels to me as though it's more of a Democratic hold. Was there a red wave? In fact, what we found is that the red wave only happened in 2 states in the United States. The red wave did not take place in places like Wisconsin, where Tony Evers was reelected, did not take place in Arizona, where Mark Kelly was reelected and Katie Hobbs pulled out a win. It happened in 2 states and 2 states alone, the states of New York and the state of Florida. In the state of New York, Lee Zeldin outperformed what had been the Biden versus Trump by 17 points. Biden's margin over Trump in the state of New York in 2020 was 23 points. This election ended up being a 6-point advantage for Kathy Hochul. Lee Zeldin's campaign closed that gap and exhibited a red wave, which has had a dramatic effect upon the House of Representatives insofar as that red wave in New York resulted in pickups for the Republicans across the Hudson Valley. In fact, you go across all 50 states, the 2 states that had the greatest degree of Republican pickup in the House of Representatives were New York and Florida. A net 3-seat pickup in New York, a net 4-seat pickup in Florida. In Florida, the story is a little bit different. All the polling indicated, including ours, that Ron DeSantis would win, that Marco Rubio would win, but it was the margin. The polling average was 12 points. We were right on that number, and DeSantis ended up winning by 19 points, a really dramatic win in a state that not too long ago was perhaps mistakenly described as a swing state, now is a solidly red state, and DeSantis again outperformed. he outperformed Trump's margin in Florida by 16 points. So how did that happen? Why are we having a red wave, an isolated red wave? Because we're used to in politics seeing these waves sweep across the country. Our theory, what we seem to find from our polling, is that in the states where abortion and threats to democracy were most significant to voters, the red wave did not occur. In states like New York, where voters feel as though abortion rights were not threatened, where democracy was not threatened, other issues predominated and the red wave did occur. The second component is that candidate competency matters, and the voters of New York found that Lee Zeldin was a competent choice and voted in a way that closed that gap. And certainly in the state of Florida, the voters of Florida felt as though Ron DeSantis was doing an excellent job, and they poured to the polls on his behalf. So what mattered in this election? You know, it's really a multivariate analysis. By training, I'm what's called a quantitative sociologist, so I look at multivariate analyses. And here you can see that all these factors mattered in the election in different degrees in different states. Did the Dobbs decision matter? Absolutely. In a state like Michigan, it might have been the most important issue that ended up turning the Michigan legislature Democratic, that reelected Gretchen Whitmer, that kept the Attorney General and Secretary of State in office. In other states where we saw Republican candidates who were perceived by voters as just not quite up to the job, that was enough to overcome what were the established conditions that would have indicated that we would have a red wave. So in a state like Pennsylvania, for example, January 6th mattered to voters. Democracy mattered to voters. But at the same time, in a state like New York, where voters did not feel as though their democratic rights were threatened, where they did not feel as though a woman's right to choose was at issue, an issue like crime and the economy rang true to voters and indicated that there was an opportunity here in New York for that red wave. Where do we go from here? How do Americans feel? What's the next 10 years going to look like for us? Well, Americans are a little bit ambivalent about what kind of a country we have, who we are, where are we going from here. Slightly fewer than 50% say, when asked, that the United States is the greatest country in the world. 42% say it's a great country, but perhaps not the greatest. Do you think our political system can still address the nation's problems? Do we have the structure in order to address the problems that voters identify, economic problems, problems in an arena like healthcare, issues of crime, issues of voting access, issues of racial disparities? Do we have a political system that can do the job or not? This is a troubling response that we found. This is a national result here. By only 7 points, 50 to 43, Americans, though, say that they believe our country is too divided politically to solve its problems. Certainly, I think that's a finding that each and every one of us would like to find not to be the case. But voters right now feel as though perhaps we are too divided. And certainly the drama that we're going to see played out over the next several months as we change from one Congress to another, voters will be watching. Voters will be watching to see whether the manner in which the new Congress takes office is going to indicate that absolutely we are too divided, or perhaps are there issues, are there areas where we can overcome those partisan divides and achieve something. These folks here, some of the leaders that we're all going to be watching as we watch the change in government, as we watch the new Congress take office, as we watch the beginning of, unfortunately, the 2024 election, which has already started, right? A pollster gets no rest. So we're going to watch each and every one of these leaders And are they going to listen to the voice of the voters who did not provide a red wave, who did not provide a mandate for the Republicans in the House of Representatives, and are really saying, we'd like you to work in a manner that solves our country's problems rather than perpetuating them. On a note of good news, when we ask New Yorkers, this is a question that we asked in New York, we've asked this nationally as well, do you think that New York's best days are behind us, or do you think that New York's best days lie ahead? Fortunately, there is a resilient optimism amongst voters when we give them an opportunity to respond to this question. And by a 2-to-1 margin, New York voters are prepared to say, I still think our best days lay ahead. But clearly, we're looking for action, practical, legislative initiatives and successes from our political leaders rather than partisan attempts to seek power and nothing else than power as we move forward. So certainly I wanted to give you a quick overview. I wanted to introduce you to the idea of ticket splitting, give you some indication of the location of 2 red waves and where there were not. If you have any, during Q&A, if you're interested in any of the nitty-gritty of polling, I'm certainly happy to respond to those, and I look forward to sharing our thoughts with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. So some really, really interesting things in there. Let's start at a high level, and Liz, I'm going to go to you first. From what we just saw, and from a national perspective, your takeaways from the election?
Well, I think that reporters really like a story. And I'm not suggesting that they created the red wave, but they certainly glommed onto it early on, especially in New York, where the issue of public safety and crime was front and center, in part because Eric Adams made it that way during the mayoral race in New York City and sort of set the tone for that. So I think most people who were watching, I certainly thought it was overblown to some degree, that there wouldn't be a red wave necessarily, but mid-corrections is traditional. Actually, I was surprised that the Democrats managed to hold the Senate, and barely, and then subsequently moved, one of the first things they did was move to protect same-sex marriage, which, as a result of the Dobbs decision, many people are afraid will be eroded, along with a number of other social protections that the court has put in place. So that spoke to the ideology and the importance of speaking to the grassroots. At least to me, I interpreted it as the majority leader really being interested in codifying that support among the liberals, who, in New York at any rate, were pretty angry about the way that things went down. And we're seeing that fallout continue with internal Democratic strife targeted at Jay Jacobs, because somebody's head has to roll, and he seems to be a Cuomo holdover, and so he's a pretty easy target. But I don't know. I think that the coverage a little bit was overblown and overhyped to some degree. And since I'm not a reporter anymore, I can say those sorts of things. But the outcome, was certainly a lot closer than everybody expected. And now you see a lot of soul searching going on both sides.
Bill, what do you think? What are your takeaways from it?
I mean, just listening to this presentation, the thing that struck me was the equilibrium we have. We have these very increasingly polarized parties, but neither of them can get any kind of dominance at the national level. And in New York, we have a Democratic dominance, but at the national level, they keep this kind of a seesaw, and neither party can maintain control of any of the branches of government for an extended period. And it's I feel like the results of this election, it was kind of a vote for gridlock. It was a vote for, okay, we want to have one party in the House, and which is a recipe for nothing happening.
Right.
you could see that as an attempt to calm the situation. I don't know if it was conscious, but it's just striking to me how, as passionate as people feel about their respective parties, and as convinced as they are that they are the ones who are in the right and the other ones are a threat to democracy, they're battling and coming to a stalemate constantly for as long as I can remember.
Amelia?
I was going to say,
You're good.
the one thing I wanted two things. I think people need to get uncomfortable about, conventional wisdom. The last few cycles have not been anything what people have expected or anticipated, so we're still trying to catch up on, what does this mean, 2016? And I also want to say that since then, this was an unusual election for many reasons, coming off of the last cycle with the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, all of these things you're putting into this recipe, and people are still trying to say, why are we so surprised? The one thing I loved your presentation, I have hope for democracy because I feel like people clearly said, and it's a nonpartisan issue, free and fair elections matter. And the results from 8 days ago, that's what I read, that people really do care about free and fair elections, no matter what party you're on. And really looking at the ballot initiatives, whether it was abortion, voting, there was a ranked choice voting thing that passed in Arizona. It's like, I think we're going to slowly be seeing things like this coming up, but I have some hope for the future. And I know we'll probably talk a lot about New York a lot more, but I think that is, people are still, why this, why that? There was $20 million in this race that was negative on on Governor Hochul. That was 3 times as much as ever spent. Looking back at the numbers, I think the highest was $4 million. $20 million of every single day, negative. People don't really take that into account as well.
Do you say that because the election deniers largely were defeated? That you had hope for democracy, or because of the results in Don's overview? Because what troubles me about it is that there's no definition of democracy. I don't know what small d of democracy means to the average voter. When they say democracy is a threat, I bet you if you dug deeper in that, which obviously, you made a lot of calls, so I'm not sure that you had time. But what does that mean? Because January 6th occurred? Because Donald Trump continues to insist that he doesn't accept the last loss that he had? Because what? So I don't know necessarily what that means.
Well, it certainly means different things to different voters. In our polls, when we asked the question, who do you think was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election? Nationally, we still found that close to 30% of Americans say that they believe that Donald Trump was a legitimate winner of the 2020 election. So that group of voters feel that democracy is threatened because the election was stolen.
Right.
Other voters feel that because of January 6th and the the extent that people went to attack the Capitol, that's the reason why democracy is threatened. I think that, in some ways, to your point, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day that called out saying that finally with Hobbs winning in Arizona, that was an indication that Stop the Steal is done. I'm not convinced that that's the case yet. And when you look at margin after margin in some of these Secretary of State races, some of the races in which folks who said that Donald Trump was a legitimate winner of the 2020 election, they were razor thin. But in virtually every case, they went in favor of the candidate who disagreed with that position. But in many cases, you're talking, these were 1% races. So what's going to happen from here? Are the folks who subscribe to the Stop the Steal perspective, are they going to move off of that and move on? That's yet to be seen.
also there's, I mean, with the $20 million figure that you cited, there's a certain dog whistle element to that. Like all that money spent against a woman, like a certain element of women can't be sufficiently tough on crime. Like there were certainly some very troubling elements in some of these races. I mean, I saw you laugh when the picture of Warnock and Walker came up. I mean, that's a crazy situation. But then, there were also allegations against Fetterman who experienced a stroke, and then subsequently questions about his mental capacity, et cetera. And it was a choice of sort of bad and less bad in that situation. But there were a lot of really troubling undercurrents that I thought ran through a lot of these races that were not called out.
I totally agree, and having been part of firm I work with was on the Fetterman campaign, and that was just extremely grueling. And my history, with the women running for office, I think the undercurrent of the attacks that real great candidates that were up on, that ended up winning, I think that the notion that we're going to have a gridlock in Congress now, I'm afraid of what's going to happen in 2024, because I don't know. I have a little bit of hope that something's going to happen, but I think blaming it on the people who won by smaller margins, we haven't been able to get things done, is really going to pan out for the presidential.
It was interesting on that one question around the threat to democracy. I hadn't thought of it, but you've got, typically it's, you're on one side or the other, but you've got folks from, with different perspectives answering, yes, it is, whether it's J6 or whether it's, Donald Trump and overthrowing or freedom of speech and things like that. So it is really interesting when you put those two together that it becomes a pretty significant number, and for me it was a little startling. So let's think about, so take it down one notch, and your information is really great, kind of those moving pieces or those opinion, what changed, but kind of regionally. Right, and then, some of those things, whether, was it abortion, was it crime, and then kind of the downfall and then the outcome of those different states.
But even in New York, like you saw the Ryan race, for example, turned on abortion. We saw those ads were like relentless, and they were all about Dobbs. Every single one of them seemed like, and he leaned into his veteran status, which was very interesting because you don't see candidates with that experience as much. Matt Castelli also had, some government status, and he didn't do so well against Elise Stefanik, who's a Trump embracer. So it just seemed like there wasn't a true line through any of that, because what worked in some of the early races didn't necessarily pan out later on down the road.
Yeah, I think the overall sense in New York, you go from top to ticket, and it's a dramatic movement of just a D to R vote of 17 points. Yeah. It did seem as though Zeldin took a position that abortion is settled business in the state of New York, seeking to reassure voters that that was not something that would be on his agenda. And then, of course, people were in the political business say, well, he's going to face a Democratic Assembly, he's going to face a Democratic Senate, so there'd be only little that he could do. But still, that movement in New York that was so dramatically different from virtually every state appeared to us to be centered really to a certain extent on the belief in New York that abortion is not threatened. Whether that was an issue that got Ryan, when Ryan won by about a point. And the other races, Riley wasn't able to succeed.
Yeah, but Zeldin didn't go out early enough with his abortion. He waffled early on. He also said that he wouldn't have a problem putting in a pro-life health commissioner, right, which this room knows actually makes a difference from a regulatory standpoint and an enforcement standpoint. I mean, he could ostensibly, you could make Planned Parenthood's life very difficult from a state regulatory DOH standpoint if you wanted to.
So interesting. Dobbs definitely had an influence, right? That I don't know if people saw it coming or not, but across the board from those stats and by state, it clearly did play out.
I mean, it sure looks that way. I mean, I think if without that decision, I think the red wave probably would have materialized in a way that people were expecting. It was just like in terms of the expectations that surround any midterm election, it usually goes to the party that's not the president's party. And so one of the reasons people are sort of surprised at this result is that it wasn't predominantly Republican. A point I wanted to make about what happened in New York State. Your results showed New York as being one of those states where the voters thought the state was going in the wrong direction. I'm going to guess, you didn't have results for this, I'm going to guess that they were relatively okay with the direction of Washington because we're a blue state and we're going to be pro-Biden and what Biden and the Democratic Congress have been doing. So what was the outcome of our election, though, was pretty much status quo at the state level, and we're sending a bunch more Republicans to Washington. I just thought that was ironic. It's largely an outgrowth of a redistricting process that kind of went in an unexpected direction.
Which is not over. The state assembly is yet to, whatever.
And I also think it's important to say there was an awful lot of negative advertising in this governor's race. A lot of it was paid for by a single person through super PACs. But I think when the final math is done, Kathy Hochul will have spent significantly more money. Kathy Hochul and her supporters will have spent more money than Lee Zeldin and his supporters. And a good amount of her advertising was also negative. It was, we can't go with a guy who supported Trump and we can't go with a guy who supports, who opposes abortion rights.
But it's interesting, it didn't work, in effect. I mean, it worked to the extent where Kathy Hochul won.
Neither of the candidates.
Right? But if you look at, say, Pennsylvania, I mean, we share a border with Pennsylvania. And, Josh Shapiro, very capable candidate, but his campaign sought to portray and identify Doug Mastriano as dangerous, as just too radical. And I think you could probably have switched the names in some of the ads. And Hochul was trying to do the same thing with Zeldin. But in Pennsylvania, it ended up with, Shapiro winning by 14 and overperforming. And here, Hochul underperformed.
But there's also, you can't get around the reality regarding the enrollment in this state. I mean, the enrollment edge for Democrats is significant. I mean, the shorthand is 5-1 statewide, 5-3 New York City. It's probably somewhere in there at this point.
Well, it's 2-1 state and 5-1 New York City.
5-1, okay. So, but also the population drain and like all of these things, come into play. But at the end of the day, like you really need to work and in New York City as a Republican to overcome that. Had he not been a Trump supporter, had he not said some of the things that he said about January 6th, he might have had a better shot. And also when you talk about candidate quality, Kathy Hochul is a utilitarian campaigner. She's tireless and indefatigable, and we all sort of know that trope about her, but she's not a great public speaker. She's not like a crowd rallier. And, that probably also, that lack of enthusiasm, perceived enthusiasm, probably also hurt her.
Hey, Don, how did those polls change from the summer on the Hochul-Zeldin race to what it ended up being 3 points?
It was a 6-point race finally, and the polls changed dramatically. The polls in the summertime were in the range of 15, 16. In fact, we did an experiment where we polled with our friends at Emerson College, who use an entirely different methodology, and we agreed that we would poll the Hochul-Zeldin race at the same time, with the same sample, with the same survey, and we were a point apart in the summer. So that was a pretty convincing number. And then as time moved on, most especially as we moved into October, we dropped into single digits. There was a credible poll that had it as close as 4 points in October.
Came through. So the Senate stays Democrat. It looks like the House is going to go to the Republicans. What do you think can come out of a gridlocked government like that?
Nothing.
Overall, nothing?
Judicial appointments?
There are some, I think it's safe to say that like the big dramatic things on healthcare, like the idea of single payer or even a public option or significant expansions of coverage, those aren't going to go anywhere. There is a chance that, from what I understand, that there's a certain degree of bipartisan support for sort of technical things like, improving telehealth or more price transparency from hospitals. You could sort of imagine a path for those things happening. But the thing that I'm going to be watching for is in the House, because it's such a narrow majority, you have the opportunity for hostage taking by the most radical members of the Republican conference. We've seen that dynamic happen, not exactly the same way in the New York State Senate when it was very closely divided. We've seen that happen in the US Senate when the most conservative member of the Democratic Party dominated a lot of the debates. So you might imagine that in light of these results, the powers that be in the Republican Party would want to hew a more moderate line. They might want to pivot away from Trumpism and try to show that they can govern, conceivably. They may not be allowed to. They may not have that opportunity because the Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to say something outrageous, and she's going to be an important vote that they need, even to elect a speaker, not, let alone to do the debt ceiling or whatever else they have to do. So it has the potential to be really messy.
Yeah, I was going to say, it depends on how nasty the race for speaker becomes and how fractured they are post-mortem after that. And once the primaries start happening, I don't know what people can actually do. And they actually have to deliver on something to be re-elected next cycle, but I think it really depends on how much this actually speaker's race go down if Kevin McCarthy actually ends up being speaker.
All right,
Well, they're all running again right now. The 2024 election cycle has begun, and some of the folks who have been elected, take a couple of the New York cases, take Lawler, take Molinaro. They're going to have to come back and face their voters quite soon, and if indeed their first couple of months in office they were participating in investigating Hunter Biden, in casting a vote to impeach Joe Biden, they're going to have to weigh a pretty tough calculus as to whether they're going to bring that position back to New York and end up running on that when they've won elections by 1-2 points. So I think that it's doubtful we'll see any significant legislation, but there could be some defections and alliances that are hard to predict right now. Democrats, in some cases, moving to vote with a more moderate wing of the Republican Party, or some moderate Republicans sort of splitting with a more aggressive agenda of the Republicans. So that could happen on some issues, some funding issues, issues relative to Ukraine. So there could be some alliances that are hard to predict right now. A lot of Congress folks who were elected in tight districts that I don't think are prepared to run on the Marjorie Taylor Greene platform.
Another thing that could happen, even in the absence of agreement between the two houses, the House could do a whole bunch of what they call oversight, investigations and hearings. And some of them could be about national issues like Hunter Biden or impeaching the president. But there's also an opportunity for the House to open an investigation of stuff that's particular to New York.
Yeah.
And one thing that comes to mind is they could take a look at parts of New York's Medicaid program, which are enormously expensive, or they could look at what happened during the pandemic. If they wanted to reopen that can of worms. And one reason it makes me think that they might go in that direction is that we do have Elise Stefanik, who's the third-ranking member of the new majority leadership, and who has shown a willingness to mix it up with Democrats in Albany, like to target them as foils in her
Especially
political
Andrew
profile.
Cuomo. a little less so Hochul, but yeah. I mean, it is interesting when you look at it, New York really shouldn't be a player when it comes to GOP politics because of the Democrat dominance in the state, and yet Lee Zeldin's being mentioned as an RNC chair because of his success in a state as Democrat dominated as we are. We may be blamed or celebrated, depending on how you look at it, for providing the balance that enabled the Republicans to take the majority in the House, which is part of the thing that's fueling the fight over redistricting and who's to blame for it. And you have Elise Stefanik, who's the third highest ranking Republican, you know, coming from New York. It's kind of amazing, actually, that we'll be, as a state,
We have the Senate Majority Leader and the third ranking member.
Right. Well, but that seems normal. And that Hakeem Jeffries, I mean, Nancy Pelosi's going to say whatever it is that she says today, and Hakeem Jeffries is in line, you know, for that job. I think there'll be a fight for it. But still, I mean, we really have, you know, quite a considerable dominance on the national stage.
So I'll go one 2024 question, and then we'll try to get down to New York. But Joe Biden doesn't run. Potential Democratic candidates?
I mean, I think I have to at least bring this up. Anybody who becomes New York governor starts to think, hey, could I be president? I think there probably was a flash of that after the Democratic primary when Kathy Hochul won, so kind of, I mean, she didn't even have opposition. So I think that's much diminished by this outcome. So whatever thought she had, unless she can have just a gangbuster next couple of years and run the table in the legislature.
It's not going to happen.
Unfortunately, she didn't run on any kind of platform. She ran a mostly I'm not the other guy kind of race. I don't think she has any kind of mandate, especially when you combine her lack of positive agenda with her weak showing in the polls. I think she runs the risk of being kind of pushed around by the legislature, which would be kind of poisonous for her future career.
I mean, you know, it's all the usual suspects, right, that people are talking about. Buttigieg is in there for sure. Kamala Harris, what's she going to do? She's probably too closely tied to Biden. I mean, everybody is starting to, you know, make their moves now, and there's a bunch of names that are out there, none of which are really inspiring, honestly. And of course, Donald Trump's already announced, so there's no secret to that. And DeSantis on the Republican side, that's going to be a fight between the two of them that they may just destroy each other before we even get there because it's so early. It's so much has to happen before that. I mean, how the international, you know, world shakes out. It's so hard to say. I mean, before the pandemic, nobody even thought we could have a pandemic. Now, who knows? You know, in 3 months, we could be in a completely different place. So,
I think just even the, you know, ditto. And when you look at some of the other, like, big states, you know, what is a mandate now? Like, barely one person got over 60%, and that was Maura Healey in Massachusetts. But other states, PJ in Illinois, Gavin, like these big blue states, Democratic governors, but no one really had a mandate. And I don't know who's really tested on a national level in a real way. You know, Hochul, you know, my bias, but Hochul she did get a lot of outside money that went against her. It was a grueling race here in New York, but I think that our bench needs to be a lot deeper.
yeah.
Well, at this point in polling, America wants neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden to run for president, and they're both the front runners at this point. So the decision's got to be made on both of those leading candidates before the door opens. And obviously, Trump's trying to clear the field right now. Seems that you know, he hasn't had immediate success in so doing, and I think we'll hear something from Biden very soon. I think sometime after Christmas, Biden's going to indicate whether he is or isn't going to run.
Sometime after his 80th birthday.
Yes, just after the 80th birthday.
He'll tell us all about it.
And, if I had to bet, I'd bet that he's going to walk to the mic and say he's going to run.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Yep, and you're right, it did start, right? It started, the 2024 race started the other night, so here we go.
To ruin Don's Christmas.
Yes.
So let's talk locally in New York. I was taken back when I never thought New York would be part of a red wave. But what can we get done here? What do you see next, particularly with how it's set up? I know all the races aren't done, but we know where it's going to land. Anything in the overall we can get done or on the healthcare front?
I mean, I feel like if you're expecting that the legislature will look at these results and cool their jets, I don't think that's going to happen. And in fact, I think we're already seeing there's a pretty significant push from Senator Ramos to do a big increase in the minimum wage. So I think
Big
the
increase in,
progressive,
I'm sorry?
the minimum wage,
Minimum
I'm
wage.
sorry, yeah. She's arguing that it should be done in the lame duck session so that it can take effect in January. And she wants it to be indexed to the minimum wage. It would go over $20 in a matter of a couple of years. That's the kind of progressive cause that you're going to see more and more of coming out of the legislature. It was interesting. Even when Cuomo was governor, he started to kind of lose his dominance over the legislature when the Democrats took the Senate and when they gained their majority-proof, veto-proof majority. Hochul comes in as already kind of doesn't have that juice that Cuomo brought. And now she's suffered kind of a close call in the election. I think this is going to be, the legislature is going to have a much stronger hand in this budget.
So there's a number of storylines that are not really being reported all that much yet. One of them that I'm looking at that I think is fascinating is the churn in the assembly, which is going to be crazy. I mean, not just health because Gottfried's gone, but insurance is, environment. I had them all on my head and now I can't. Housing, Abate, right. So, and then as you guys all know, there were some big losses, and so the seniority situation has changed dramatically. So you had people who are got bumped up 20 steps, which is kind of nuts. So you're going to have a really big churn at the chair level in the committee structure in the assembly, which is going to be fascinating. And whoever's going to get health, and you've heard the names, I'm sure, already are starting to emerge, it's really going to be a battle. And then also how much longer the respective leadership is going to stick around also I think is significant. You've also heard the rumors about that. So that, how much legacy building they're interested in doing in the next year, what the state's financial picture looks like. The state controller has weighed in on that, which is interesting. And also, what happened in the Senate is not entirely, but a lot of the marginals got bumped, which means that you further entrench and solidify the power of the progressives, which is what you're seeing with the flexing of Ramos. So, they're going to, and whether Kathy Hochul feels beholden or anybody really actually is buying into the line from the Working Families Party that they took her over the line and they were the ones who helped her win at the end. And, also black voters turned out for her significantly in New York City. All of this sort of goes into the pot to try and figure out, does she feel more beholden to the left, or is she going to be listening to the right or the pragmatic center that wants to see more, public safety? I mean, she seems to be not buying on that. She sort of walked back some of the things she said during the campaign already. And so it's that dynamic has yet to play out. All of that stuff is going to be significant in the next session.
Two more. Go ahead.
No.
You go.
No, I think, we're also, okay. He's coming over. He's like, you're going to have to stop talking soon. No, when I saw the results, especially looking at the health committee, housing and all these things. And I was saying this last night to a couple of people. I'm not completely surprised about, Simberwitz, Abate, like folks in South Brooklyn. Look at 2021, where we got some more, Republican women into the city council from those areas as well.
Yeah.
So I wasn't completely surprised or thrown off, but I think it's always interesting to see the leadership, whether it's going to be the speaker or the majority leader, really trying to hold the reins on an ever increasing, more progressive or more left body more left within their respective houses. It's going to be really hard to try to go the three people in the room figuring out this budget. I'm going to be watching with popcorn.
So Don, I'm going to take us home. One last thought.
We'll be back in the field
Tomorrow.
New York poll in 2 weeks. Welcome anybody's input on pertinent questions to ask to grab the landscape of pollers. Life is never done. There's always the next poll. So.
Well, Bill, Liz, Amelia, Don, thank you very, very much for sharing all your knowledge and your insights. Great conversation, and should be an interesting year or two. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.